I want to welcome everybody to the Farm and Half Gallery. It is truly my home away from home. As you can see, this is all part of a women-only show, which is a tradition here, because I had once done a show that traveled to many museums called Women Only, and I've decided to do several women shows, one each year. Please have a seat. The reason I have papers is because while I'm really in rapture about having these wonderful people with me, I've never met them before except for Marcia. And I want to make sure I get the names right. And I really want to say thank you for coming, Dr. Gavin Schmidt.
Thank you.
And Jeffrey.
Yes.
And let me get this right. I'm going to get it right. Aviva.
Yes.
Yes. And Simone.
Thank you.
Welcome, and thank you all so much for being here with us, because I'm going to tell you just a little bit about why we're doing this forum tonight. It's because of this lady, Marcia Annenberg. She's an artist who asks crucial questions, and that's why I love her art. I love her art anyway, but I love the questions that she asks. For example, in this particular work, which she calls Checkmate, which led to this panel, I'm going to just say she asks why a report from an intergovernmental panel on climate change, written by hundreds of scientists from 70 countries, and stating with 95% certainty that warming of the atmosphere and oceans is due to human activity, and it never made front page news. When I saw Marcia's art at first, I thought, oh wow, not only do I love the work, but I learned so much from this lady. And since I promised not to speak for more than a minute, and I always go over because I'm very talkative, I'm going to introduce Marcia Annenberg, who is hosting this panel.
Thank you so much, Ellie. And this is why I am so honored to be showing with Ellie Flomenhoff, because she's such a sincere, honest, visionary, and courageous gallerist, because a lot of gallerists wouldn't go near this topic, and I'm so thrilled that she does. I want to welcome everyone here. Thank you so much for coming out on this cold night. I want to thank Dr. Gavin Schmidt. I'm so honored for you to join this panel. My colleagues, Jeff Carpenter, Dr. Ariva Ramani, and Simone Spicer, thank you for agreeing to come on this panel. I met Jeff and Simone when I organized the exhibit Petroleum Paradox, which opened at the Denise Bibro Gallery 2 years ago. This catalog is now available for free on the internet. You can find it. You can send me an email. I'll send you a link to get it. I know Dr. Aviva Ramani from the Eco Caucus of the Women's Caucus for Art. And thinking back to what motivated me to do this panel, I thought of Hurricane Sandy. I can't think of any community that was more deeply affected by the flooding of Lower Manhattan than the art community. I don't live in Chelsea, but I can just imagine living here and seeing the Hudson overflow its banks, moving into the subways, coming up 22nd Street and 10th Avenue. It's just something you can't even fathom. And the dealers coming the next morning and finding their galleries in disarray, paintings ruined, flat files ruined, painting racks ruined. I just can't imagine the feeling. And what was really amazing is that I had it on the news for days. And who didn't have the news on for days? And all I kept talking about was the construction of seawalls and floodgates. Were they technically feasible? Were they affordable? When can we start building them? Let's look at the Netherlands. Let's look at Venice. But what was missing? There was something really important that was missing from all those newscasts. Where was the news coverage about something called the rise of the global average sea level due to warming water and melting glaciers? I didn't hear about that. Why did the news coverage focus on adaptation instead of prevention? Why didn't the newscasters talk about the environmental factors that make flooding more likely, that warming ocean water expands and a warmer atmosphere holds 5% more water. Why not talk about the connection between global warming and the increased risk of flooding? I am not a scientist, but I would understand that if the oceans are higher than they were 10 years ago, the flooding would be more likely. When Al Gore warned in 2006 that lower Manhattan could flood in the future, people thought it was preposterous. Does anybody here think so now? Back in 2012, you may remember, 2 months before Sandy hit, America experienced its worst drought since the 1950s. According to the US Department of Agriculture, 60% of America's farms were affected by the drought in the Midwest. Our corn and our soybean crops were badly damaged. Did anyone else think it was odd that 2 months later, during the presidential debates, not one question was asked of them about global warming? I thought it was really weird and troubling, really strange. More recently, a month ago, the same week that the grand jury decided not to indict the officers involved in the death of Eric Gardner, father of 6 children, another event occurred that wasn't widely reported. Bill McKibben, the founder of the organization 350.org, was honored in the Swedish parliament with the Right Livelihood Award for his efforts to mobilize action around the world to counter climate change. This wasn't reported in the mainstream press. I heard about it on an independent news program called Democracy Now! And I was curious, so I Googled his acceptance speech. His acceptance speech was memorable and very moving. He said, 2014 was the year we learned, tragically, that the melt of the West Antarctic is now irreversible. Irreversible? Doesn't that sound dreadful? Shouldn't the American people be allowed to hear that speech? Why must we be left in the dark? What if his award had been reported? Let's imagine another scenario. Headlines report, Bill McKibben wins Right Livelihood Award, and he warns of West Antarctica ice melt. The speech goes viral. Facebook, Twitter. People demonstrate in American cities demanding action to prevent catastrophic melting. Mothers hold signs saying, "Save our children." Does this seem far-fetched? Maybe, but not for those of us who saw the Lower East Side under 4 feet of water. It was all too real. Who are the people setting the agenda for our news? Why wasn't his speech broadcast? For those of you who haven't seen Bill McKibben's film, Do the Math, he lays out the math of global warming. Gavin, I must confess to you, math is not my favorite subject. So if I goof up the formulas, please correct me. If you're not inclined to like math like myself, I brought along a math manipulative. In the form of a glass jar. The jar represents the atmosphere. The glass is half filled with a black liquid, representing the 500 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions that have poured into the air since the Industrial Revolution began. According to several teams of climate scientists, we can safely burn another 500 billion tons. If you added 500 billion more tons to the 500 billion tons of emissions we already have, you would get 1 trillion. This would fill the glass at the top. 1 trillion tons is considered a benchmark. That is because 1 trillion tons of emissions would warm the Earth to 2 degrees Celsius. The EU and the G8 have agreed that that is the safe upper limit of warming. We are currently at 1 degree Celsius. The question is, how much time do we have before we hit that threshold? Please be patient, a little bit more math. Collectively, we emit 30 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. If you divide 30 billion into 500 billion, or half a trillion, you get 16. We have 16 years left at the current rate of emissions before Earth hits a 2-degree threshold. For those of you who have grandchildren born this year, they will face a very different future from ours because the amount of carbon dioxide and other gases in the air have increased since we were born. Dr. James Hansen, speaking to the New York Press Club in 2011, said, "We are in a planetary emergency." The question then becomes, why don't the American people know that? According to a recent poll by Yale and George Mason University, 23% of Americans deny climate change. If 1/4 of the American public is dismissive or doubtful about global warming, what can we do about this discrepancy between observed science and the spread of misinformation? How can we as artists and women contribute as activists to this issue? I've thought of the acronym MAMI, M-A-M-I, Mothers Against Melting Ice Caps. You don't need to be a mom, men are welcome. You just need to love Mother Earth. Thank you. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Gavin Schmidt. Dr. Schmidt is a climate scientist who works on understanding past, present, and future climate change. He is the director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies and adjunct faculty with the Earth Institute of Columbia University. He is committed to communicating science to the general public, making sure that general readers have access to the basics of climate science. His TED Talk, 2014, was focused on simulating the emergent patterns of climate change. He is the author, with Josh Wolf, of Climate Change, Picturing the Science, 2009. Co-founder of the website realclimate.org, and was awarded the American Geophysical Union's inaugural Climate Communications Prize in 2011. On Twitter, he is @ClimateOfGavin. Thank you so much, Gavin, for being here.
Thanks, Marsha. I don't really know what to say. So I am a climate scientist. I occasionally play one on TV. And I like giving talks about global warming on a cold, snowy night, right? Because none of you are just fair weather people who are interested, right? You have to be really interested to come out on a night like this. I spend a lot of time thinking about those same questions that Marsha raised. What is it about a problem that gets people's attention? Why are some problems newsworthy, other problems not? What is it that gets front page news? As much as it might be great to have an obscure prize being given away in a different country getting front page news here, that's never going to happen, regardless of who it is or whatever prize that was. Even if it was a Nobel Prize, it wouldn't have got front page news. Now, having got front page news on the Times on Saturday, I feel that I am newly denoted as being somebody who knows how to get something on the front page, right? So if you didn't notice, there was a big map of temperatures of the world in 2014, which we keep a record. We collate all of this information from weather stations around the world, from the oceans, sea surface temperatures, and from Greenland and from Antarctica and from the Arctic. We put it together, and every year we say, well, how hot was it really? And last year, so 2014, it was quite hot. But the numbers that come out don't mean anything to anybody. What does 0.68 degrees Celsius mean to anybody? Without context, it's just a number, right? Is that a big number? Is that a small number? Nobody has any idea. And so when you talk about these things kind of devoid of context just in terms of the scientific data, you generally get what I just got from you then. Just kind of well, that might be interesting. Where's the buffet? Okay. And so, many moons ago, I started talking to other people who are interested in communicating these things, and I started talking to a lot of photographers, particularly the ones that I worked with in the book. Josh Wolf, who used to be a professional photographer in Dumbo, Peter Essick, who worked for National Geographic, Gary Brash, who has his own books and has done a lot of exhibits here in the city as well, and they were trying to connect to people about this general subject, but not in ways that are, so technical, not 0.3, 0.4, 2 degrees, 0.68 degrees, but in ways that normal people would feel a kind of visceral connection to. One of the most effective ways that they showed me, and I've used this subsequently, is if you go pretty much anywhere in the world where there is ice, and you find old photographs of what that place used to look like. And this can be in the Rockies, it can be in the Andes, the Himalayas, the Alps, Kilimanjaro, Papua New Guinea, the Arctic, Canada. Anywhere you go, pretty much, you can find 100-year-old photographs, and then, or even in the Alps, 200-year-old paintings. And you go to that exact same spot now, and it's a landscape transformed, where there was nothing but cold and ice. There are lakes and trees, and any ice that you can see is so far off in the distance that you can't even tell that it's ice. And when people see the change that even those 0.68 or 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit have made in the space of 100 years, people get a sense that, oh, something is changing, something is happening that the planet is noticing. It's not just scientists noticing something technical is changing, but it's something that the planet itself is noticing. And not just glaciers, but ecosystems and plants and people and agriculture. We live in such a fast mode that sometimes that we don't see that. But the art, the photography was able to kind of capture that time and that distance and make a visceral connection to people directly that didn't have to be processed. And so since then, I've been talking more and more to groups of artists and to individual artists, and trying to see what you can do that continues to make that kind of visceral connection. Because the scientists that I hang out with, we train ourselves so strongly not to have visceral reactions. We train ourselves so strongly to look at the numbers, to look at the graph, to codify everything, to quantify everything. That takes a lot of work. It's very powerful. It's very useful. It gives us a lot of predictive value. But it isn't the same as communicating that information or the consequences of that information to normal people or to people who are just interested, or even abnormal people, quite frankly. Which pretty much covers everybody, right? Yeah. And so, so I've worked subsequently with, people who are singer-songwriters and composers and artists and photographers, and each of them in their way has been trying, dancers. I don't know, Jodie Sperling, do you know her? No. Yeah, she just went up to the Arctic, and she was she's doing some choreography based on what she was feeling being right on the ice, and it's really beautiful. You should go and check it out. And I think she's got a show that's coming up in this month or next month. And these are all people who are trying to grasp some essential aspect of that you can communicate without having to think too hard about this, right? To get a sense of what's going on. The hardest part, of course, is this idea that we only get our news kind of in short sound bites and on front page and headlines and things like that. most of the stuff that is news is something that's happening right now. It wasn't happening yesterday, it happened today, and it won't happen tomorrow. That's what makes news. Something that is almost exactly the same as it was yesterday, but just a little bit worse, almost never makes news. And that's for almost all of our issues, whether it's long-term unemployment or the social security crisis or global warming. These things are not newsworthy. Right? And the difference between the kinds of things that are on the front page and the kinds of things that you have to have a sustained and sustainable conversation about is this difference between, acute pain and chronic pain. Right? If I fall over and I break my arm, I go directly to the hospital. I don't worry about my, what appointment I had. I don't worry about all the other things. I know what I'm going to do. If somebody stops me in the seat and says, "Oh my God, your cholesterol is too high," I say, "Oh, well, I'll deal with that tomorrow," right? Or maybe next week, or maybe next year, or maybe never, right? Those things are very different. We react very differently to them. Now, climate change, sometimes we see its acute impacts, but most often it's a chronic problem. And chronic problems, like any of you who've ever tried to lose weight or lower your cholesterol or, worry about retirement or all those things, you have to think about them not all the time every day, but at least a little bit of the time, almost all days, right? And that's a very, very hard habit to get into. And I think the fundamental problem that we have in making this a problem, in making this a recognized problem, is in translating the knowledge that we have as scientists, the knowledge of communication, and how people think that artists have, and making it into not something that dominates your every waking moment, but something that is always there. And when we make decisions, it forms part of the things that you take into account when you make decisions, and not just for your everyday decisions, but but the people who are making big decisions in our community, in our city, at our state, at our federal level. And that's a real challenge, and it's certainly not going to be just the scientists that have to step up to that challenge, but it's going to have to be the artists and the journalists and the writers and the dancers and the photographers and pretty much everybody else as well. So there you go.
Thank you so much.
So I'm going to read the short biographies of each of the 4 artists who will speak, alphabetically. Marcia Annenberg is a painter and installation artist. Her work has been featured in galleries and museums throughout the United States. She recently spoke at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School at the Bernstein Gallery on the relationship between the decline of American print and broadcast journalism and its effect on American democracy. Her recent work tracks the suppression of news about global warming. Jeff Carpenter, with the collaborative artist team Johnny Everyman, uses socialist realism to celebrate the dystopia of capitalism. Carpenter's work has been shown at PS1, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and the Centre Pompidou. In 2007, he organized the multimedia exhibition Experiencing the War in Iraq in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, which was the launch of Johnny Everyman. Aviva Ramani's transdisciplinary artworks are shown and published internationally. As an affiliate at the Institute for Arctic and Alpine Research, University of Colorado at Boulder, she produces the Gulf to Gulf webcasts from 2009 to the present to address climate change accessed from over 84 countries. Ramani is completing a PhD with the Zurich node of the University of Plymouth on, quote, trigger point theory as aesthetic activism, end quote. Her project Ghost Nets, from 1990 to the present, restored a former town dump site to flourishing wetlands, and Blue Rocks in 2002 helped catalyze a USDA expenditure of over $500,000 to restore 26 acres of critical wetlands habitat in the Gulf of Maine. Simone Spicer's sculptures in Trash comment on our culture's precarious relationship with the natural world. She recombines familiar objects, post-consumer goods, in unexpected ways. playfully revealing the innocence of humanity while addressing our dire need for collective awareness and vision for change. She has shown her recent works in trash at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Philadelphia Seaport Museum, and the Woodmere Museum of Art, Philadelphia.
Thank you, Jeff. There's one question I asked each artist to answer. And that question was, what person or event focused your artwork on the issue of global warming? Because we've all had other genres of types of work that we've worked on. So was there a trigger? What was it? And for me, it was a person. I'll go first. We're going in alphabetical order. Sorry, my last name is A. For me, it was a person. That person is Dr. James Hansen, the former director of NASA, Goddard Institute for Space Studies from 1981 to 2013. 25 years ago, in 1988, he testified in Congress before the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee to warn the country about the greenhouse effect, how CO2 and other emissions trap solar radiation from the sun and is therefore increasing the temperature of the atmosphere and the ocean. Congress has steadily ignored those warnings. So in 2009, Dr. Hansen started to engage in civil disobedience. In February 2013, he went to Washington to protest the building of the Keystone Pipeline, which he has called game over for the planet. He got arrested in front of the White House. This action inspired my artwork. Early Wednesday morning. It is currently on view at the Fairleigh Dickinson College Art Gallery in Teaneck, New Jersey. It is based on Hopper's work, Early Sunday Morning. The repetition of the windows and the rectangularity of the composition resonated with me. Go back. The barber pole signifies and places the work at a point of departure from its originating source. I was frankly amazed that America's leading climate scientist had to get arrested to publicize his opposition to tar sands development. I tracked the coverage of his arrest and was further horrified to find out that the national press didn't cover it. In the artwork, you see the cover of the New York Times, the LA Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Detroit Free Press. There is no mention of the arrest in front or inside the papers. Only the Washington Post gave the event the coverage it deserved. 4 columns on page 4. We need to ask ourselves 2 important questions. Number 1, why does a leading American climate scientist need to resort to civil disobedience? That's incredible. Number 2, what does it say about American journalism if they ignore his arrest? That's also incredible. We'll move on to Checkmate, which is on the side of the gallery. The title was inspired by my father, Morton Annenberg, who was a chess master. The king is in check when his opponent warns that he's about to go into checkmate, when he can no longer move. This work documents the partisan reporting of global warming news. Although today's Republican Party likes to frame the climate debate as a liberal issue, an international group of scientists has been contributing reports to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, since 1990. The recent summary report, sorry to mention this again, Ellie, the recent summary report states 95% certainty of human causation of climate change due to the burning of fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal. Hundreds of scientists from dozens of countries contributed. The results are neither Democratic, Republican, or independent. It's an international report. My artwork reveals the reporting of this document to have a partisan bias in the American press. For example, conservative papers like the Wall Street Journal and the Dallas Morning News placed the report on pages 9 and 15. The New York Times and the LA Times place it on page 1. Murdoch's New York Post is in a class by itself. It doesn't report it at all. I repeat this issue 4 times in the composition to symbolize the reach of the Murdoch media empire. He is the CEO of Fox News, a station that promotes misinformation about our climate crisis to the American public. A recent article in the Journal of Communication, The Mutual Reinforcement of Media Selectivity, states, conservative media use increases global warming uncertainty and undermines consensus on mitigation policies. The role of the press in the polarization of the American public cannot be underestimated. Global warming is not the same issue as gun control, taxes, or women's rights. What is at stake is the continuation of life on Earth as we know it. At this point in time, the atmosphere and the oceans have been chemically altered. To turn this into a partisan debate is simply irresponsible. The continuing discharge of oil, gas, and coal emissions without accountability has taken its toll on Earth's fragile ecosystems. The handcuff in the upper left-hand corner symbolizes the culpability of fossil fuel companies for ecocide taking place: melting ice caps, glaciers, droughts, mudslides, flooding. It sounds very biblical. To conclude, taken separately, each of the media events I mentioned, which were underreported, could be overlooked as an oversight. Taken together, the incomplete coverage of Hurricane Sandy, the absence of questioning during the presidential debates, the non-coverage of Dr. Hansen's arrest, the non-coverage of Bill McKibben's award, and the partisan coverage of the IPCC report reveal that the Founding Fathers' vision of freedom of the press has been subverted. The press is no longer an instrument to watch over the government. The press is now free not to report critically important news. Is this absence of news a new form of inverse propaganda? What don't we know? And why don't we know it? If the public remains uninformed, mitigation of this problem is impossible. Is global warming the canary in the coal mine letting us know that our democracy itself is coming apart? Thank you so much. Jeffrey, please go on.
This also doubles as a plumbing interruption. You've heard of Roto-Rooter, so make sure if you get a chance to sign on for one of these. So my transformative moment was truly transformative when it happened, because for the 30 years that I had been making art up until then, I had never seen any political art that I thought was worthwhile. I didn't think it was really possible, that it was an oxymoron, with the possible exception of Picasso's painting Guernica. But I really felt that way, that there's a profound ontological experience that happens in the presence of art, and that I hadn't seen anyone be able to carry that into political art. But then in the summer of 2006, I read in the New York Review of Books an article by James Hansen, once again, reviewing the book Field Notes from a Catastrophe, which many of you may know, by Elizabeth Kolbert. And I was struck by one paragraph where he said that the planet was heading safely towards a 5 degree Fahrenheit rise in temperature, which, by the way, would be 2.7 Celsius, and that the last time that temperature existed on Earth, the oceans were 80 feet higher. And it hit me in the stomach. It's just like a gut punch. And everything turned on its head. I stopped making paintings. I had been doing some work with documentary filmmakers, and I went around and said, I want to make the movie an inconvenient truth for the other 50% of the population who didn't get it. The title song will be Highway to Hell, AC/DC. We're on the highway to hell. One of the prime characters in it will be Willie Nelson with his project for creating biodiesel fuel from the French fry restaurants. And I'll just raise the money. Who wants to sign up to be the documentary filmmaker? And because I had certain connections, I got something going. And for about 3 months, things were going, and then they fell away. There wasn't the energy, the follow-through, the commitment for it to happen. Now, in 2006, there was also something else on our minds, which was the Iraq War. And from my organizing with MoveOn.org, I saw that the people that were involved, the activists, the volunteers, were all in their 50s or older. And there was a Iraq vet who came back, and I asked him, what would it take to get 20-year-olds or 30-year-olds to come out? And he said, well, I don't know, if you had like some interesting art, some music that cuts at their wavelength, I think you could get them out. And that flipped a switch. And I spent the next year, basically, creating this multimedia exhibition about experiencing the war in Iraq. And for that project, I thought, okay, you're doing this, put up or shut up, come up with an art project. So I did an installation of a casket wrapped in a burnt and destroyed American flag that has just burst halfway through the wall, and the drywall is sitting on the floor. And along with some other really powerful pieces in this 12,000 square foot armory, we put on an exhibition that transformed many of the people that came there. The reactions were strong enough that I thought, okay, now, how do you turn this into making it your mission? And in the fall of 2008, there was an exhibition at the Asia Society called Art and China's Revolution that had some big, very spectacular paintings of Mao that were done as posters, but the paintings themselves were so shiny and so triumphant in their painterly execution that I got it. That was it. So I wanted to make capitalist realism. And the first painting I did was actually a direct copy of one of those paintings of Mao surveying the Guangdong province, and I just copied all of it and put next to him George W. Bush swaggering with his style along the path with Mao, called Great Leaders Instigating a Mission of Mutual Accomplishment. And based on that came the ideas for these other paintings. One of them, I don't know, do we have? So there's the Uncle Sam Wants You painting redone as Obama with the globe spinning on his forefinger. I want you to forget my promises about climate change. And the other painting that I did, that we have here tonight, the ExxonMobil drilling platform with the characters addressing the crowd, originally painted as Mitt Romney and Paul Rand, but after the election repainted with these lucha libre Mexican wrestling masks over their faces. And the crowd that they're addressing are standing on the roofs of their houses that have submerged in the ocean. And there's armed soldiers that are in the girders in between. These paintings are very large. This one is 9 feet tall. Some of the other paintings that were in the show were 12 feet wide, very large with giant black frames around them. This is a show that happened in Boston in December of 2012. And next to these paintings was a small painting this size, done in rather sort of a childish style, I think one might say, of Obama with a crown of thorns. The press reaction to the Obama with the crown of thorns was awesome. This artist got the best press reaction that I've seen for many art exhibitions. I mean, on the caliber of Chris O'Feely's show at the Brooklyn Museum with the elephant dung, where Giuliani ripped the budget away from the museum without having seen the painting. Fox News came and stood in front of the painting. They had to carefully aim the camera so that they didn't see any of the other paintings around there. And they talked about the question of whether Obama was portrayed as Christ, and never mentioned one thing about climate change, about the other issues that were brought up there. And I mention this because this is the second transformative moment in my life. This is when I stopped. This is when I realized we're outclassed. We're in a propaganda envelope that is way beyond what artists can reach. And I was running out of money. I was up against the big guns, and I thought, get smart, get real. And I haven't made another painting of this type until this past month. And it was actually just before Marcia called that the Senate investigation on the CIA reports came out. And I happened to be, for a community organization, testifying at City Hall in Philadelphia, which is this ornate building. And they have this spectacular Byzantine room with domes within domes. And I was sitting there waiting for the rest of the bureaucratic process to play out and for me to take the microphone. And I'm sitting there and I thought, what if this was the conference room of the CIA? And what if instead of these people around the conference table, it was the Statue of Liberty who's just been defrocked and ravaged on the table, and her torch falling back is setting the book of law on fire. And it came to me at that point that it doesn't matter at this point what my first reaction was about the propaganda envelope, the first challenges that we've tried to make, various artists, for political art. It's what the next wave is. And if that doesn't work, what the next wave is after that. The art world has seen that it can be led around by the nose, as Jeff Koons has provided, as other sensationalist artists have provided. And I think our challenge now is to make that work for the real values that haven't been spoken about and that have been lost in the commodification. So I've hit 3 transformation points.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here with everybody. Can you all hear me all right? And is my image up? It is. Good. So I'm going to preface what I have to say about where my Armageddon was by saying that as far as why it's hard to get the message out, I don't think there's any mystery to it. They have deliberately defunded art since at least 1989. I think that was very deliberate because artists do have a voice. We do get attention. We do have a visceral impact. Better to shut us up. How easier to shut us up than make sure we have no money? and can't support ourselves. And then we go crazy trying to support ourselves in other ways, and then there's no time to make those visceral images or products that could make a difference. There's actually, according to the Center for Climate Change Communication, there's actually only 17% of the American public that disbelieves in climate change, and they cannot be reached by any argument. However, if you present them with a profit motive, they will do anything you want. So what's really important is to reach all the rest. That's my math is not too good either. So that's 83%. Now what we have to remember is there are way more of us than there are of them. No matter how smart they think they are, no matter how much money the Koch brothers throw at it, and as of last count, it was going to be $900 million that they were going to throw at the 2016 election. So we'll find out just how smart we are. As an artist, I've always assumed that I had the capacity to model relationships to systems. When I decided to do the GhostNets project, my idea was to create a model that could be replicated by relatively ordinary person to restore degraded environments. The reason I wanted to do that was because that's one of the best ways to deal with sequestration and to mitigate climate change. When I started the project, I sent out a press release and announced, this is the decade of choice. That was 1990. Well, so much for that choice. It didn't go anywhere. Then from 2000 to 2006, I tried a lot of other things in a project called the Cities and Oceans of If. What if we went around the world and designated areas that could be restored and have bioregional impacts? That was the beginning of something called trigger point theory. The idea that you could identify a very small point in a system that could affect a large system. What turned me to something more activist about climate change specifically was Katrina. I was in Zaragoza, Spain. I was attending the Society for Ecological Restoration International Conference. Katrina hit, and I said to everybody, we've got to put out a letter. We've got to tell them that we have the people here now in Zaragoza who could turn this whole thing around. It was a whole building full of the world's best restorationists. And they said, no, we're not really ready politically. And they didn't. They didn't until about 2 years ago in Mexico. Better late than never. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I do my practice, because I consider my practice performative. It's intended as a whole life experience and as something that might change systems. The image you're looking at was after I went to Zaragoza and came back, one of the things I decided was I was not going to fly, because it seemed ridiculous to me that we had restorationists flying all over the world, emitting carbon emissions all over the waters to restore one small piece of land at a time. I decided I wasn't going to do that. So I started going by train to exhibitions when I could. Honestly, I had to break that when I decided to get a PhD, unfortunately. I had to fly to Switzerland. But in this case, I took the train to Baton Rouge. I took a train to Baton Rouge to go to a conference on deltaic systems. I specifically went during hurricane season. I wanted to track through the train window what I was seeing of how the country was changing. And one of the things I saw as we came into the bayous was what has happened to the bayous. Later, I worked on that image and digitized it, and this is called the red sky. There was a whole series of other images that came out of that were called oil and water, about how we generate that wonderful red sky and the black waters that we're now seeing all over the earth. One of the ways I digitized it was not just in Photoshop. I started doing a series of webcasts, which are mentioned in my biography, called Gulf to Gulf. I started working in 2007 with Dr. Jim White, who's the director of Instar. You probably know him. You're nodding your head. He's a great guy. And we started doing a series of webcasts about how an artist and a scientist might conceive of how to deal with climate change. We've been doing them ever since. In 2009, we started including Dr. Gene Turner from Louisiana State University, who's one of the world's experts on dead zones. Dead zones, if you're not already aware, is when you get too much nitrates into the water and you basically kill the entire system. What I was really interested in was, how can we put these different ideas together? How can we use webcasts as a point of leverage and the virtual world in general to create another system? So I think we can go to the next image. When Gene joined us and we started talking about dead zones, around 2010 is when people started talking about opening up the Arctic for shipping lanes. And needless to say, we were all utterly horrified. One of the purposes of my making artifacts, the idea was to create mnemonic devices. Artifacts that are not necessarily precious objects in themselves, but foci for meditation. So the red sky that you saw before was one kind of meditation. This is another kind of meditation. The original was created while the three of us were talking about the impacts of opening the Arctic, and you can see that to the left of the Mississippi, we have fires and forest loss. To the right, we have storms and flooding, and they all interact. And the result is basically a dead environment, and you have this little stick on the side, on the right. The trees of the mountains are cold and bare. That's what we're doing. We're making the whole mountain, the whole earth, cold and bare. But when we kept working with this image, and this particular one, by the way, is encaustic. It was a series that I did. When we started staring at this image, what we saw was that if we looked at the relationship between Iowa, for example, the factory farms, and the dead zones, and the Arctic, and off to the right, you can see where the Far Rockaways are, and in the middle of all of that is Memphis. And Memphis was really interesting to me because it seemed to me a point of leverage to restore the entire system. So the three of us went to Memphis. Actually, Jim couldn't come with us, but Gene and I did. We did a series of events, including canoeing the Wolf River. We figured out that if the Wolf River were reconnected to the Mississippi, you'd have what's called flushing. And what flushing does is it allows sedimentation to come into a system, and that's part of what protects any coastal system from flooding. Because they had interrupted where the Wolf River meets the Mississippi, they did have a major flood in 2011. So we figured out that if it were reconnected, that might mitigate some of the flooding in Memphis, and it would also impact the larger bioregion. The other thing that came out of that particular series of events in 2013 was that Jim and I calculated that at that point, if we could restore 36% of the Earth's surface, which theoretically we don't actually have, but if we could, by 2030, we could mitigate climate change. So my mission now is to engage the whole effing world in restoration, which, needless to say, requires a major retooling of how we model our lives. I think we have to move from a few individual artists doing some art of everyday life to the whole world beginning to think that each of us has enormous responsibility to repair what we've done. And how are we going to do that? I think we start with situations like this, with a group of people who are concerned, with scientists and artists, and we start figuring out how we layer the strategies. And there are many strategies. This morning I was working on editing a chapter for a book on soils. And the chapter I'm working on is a conversation with Ray Weil, who's a soil scientist. And he has this great idea for using brassicas, like radishes, to restore the soil. And he's engaged very large factory farms in using this to restore the soil. It's very simple, doesn't require any fertilizers. It's more profitable for them than using nitrates. And in our conversation, we were simply comparing his systemic approach to my own systemic approach. And the way we were able to do this was we just had a couple of conversations and webcasts, got that transcribed. It's going to go in a book. It'll reach a few people. I have to say that I'm not wildly good at marketing. And one reason is that I don't have tons of money and time to spend on that. So I think it's kind of incredible that despite that, these little webcasts that I do have reached 84 countries. So there are ways for this stuff to get out. I think people are actually desperately hungry for real information and real ideas about what can be done. And I'm thrilled to be in a position where I can discuss that in a room like this with all of you.
Thank you.
Wow, that's tough to follow, the passion of activism. Simone Spicer. I'm a sculptor, so materials are my thing. And my activism is the activism of artists who are looking at the world around us, creating objects, reflecting them back at society, just to hold up the mirror. This is where we are. This is what we're doing. As I have done some activist type work in the public and, tried to promote awareness around plastic in the environment. But for the most part, I'm in my studio, I'm creating objects, and I'm putting them out there for people to look at and assess. I've worked in trash for a lot of years, and most recently, plastic containers. And to get to Marcia's point about what brought me to activism or thoughts of global warming was around 2008. I started to notice that the trash containers that I was gathering my materials from, mostly corrugated cardboard, building people out of boxes and things with corrugated cardboard and various scraps, I started to notice that the recycling bins were just overflowing everywhere, and people were putting out cans full of small water bottles, like the ones we have here tonight, those little pony plastic water bottles. And they can be filled with water bottled in Maine and shipped to California, and water bottled in California and shipped to Maine. And everybody's got potable tap water. And I started just collecting all this plastic, not knowing what I was going to do with it. My studio's filling up, and I feel like I'm single-handedly trying to solve the problem of plastic trash. Started reading books like Edward Hume's Garbology. I don't know if any of you have heard of this. It's a wonderful book, and he says in the beginning of the book, paraphrasing, humankind has seen the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and now we're in the plastic age. So where I come into the thought about global warming is from a place of the petroleum-based product and oil and drilling and pumping. And so there's a piece of mine that Marcia really likes, and it's motorized. I'll show you a little short video in a minute. But, okay, the event that really got me going, here I'm collecting all the plastics, then the Gulf oil spill happens. Deepwater Horizon platform, right? And our mouths are like open as we watch this gushing, not they call it the largest oil spill, the largest marine oil spill anyway. Maybe it is the largest oil spill ever. And it goes on for 87 days. And every day they're saying, well, we're going to cap it on Tuesday, maybe Thursday, maybe, and the weeks go by and nothing's happening. And then we start seeing the pictures of the Gulf with the streaks of the black oil on top. And it was so amazing that they were able to even drill there like that with no real plan for remediation. And it just really bothered me. And then you see the planes coming in with the chemical dispersant. So whatever is still alive in the Gulf is nervous system tweaked. That was really sad. So I'm looking in my studio, I got all these plastic bottles, and I just started working in single-use plastic containers. And since that time, that spill in 2010, to now, I've been working primarily in single-use plastic containers. So this was the first piece I did. The other piece I'm going to show you is the last piece I did, which I just finished this past week. Wait, back up. Okay, watch. Okay, cut. Can you go back to the first picture that you had, just so I can describe the parts of this work? It's a floor piece, and it's about 46 by 46 inches, and it's just fleece fabric. It's my interpretation of the Gulf, and the fleece fabric is the polluted water, and there's white satin padding around the frame, which represents coffin lining as we put the Gulf of Mexico to rest. And the plastic containers bob in the water with small motors underneath attached to rods and little plastic ball joints so that they kind of come up and down in this squiggly, random, organic way. And want to watch it again and I'll talk? Okay. Well, what it's about is hypnosis. As you look at the bottles and you're looking for a pattern and you can't really find one because there isn't one. And I thought, this is about the hypnosis. I want it to be about the hypnosis of industry running the show for us, telling us, you need oil at the cost of the natural landscape. You need cars, you need big suburban houses, you need to drive, you need to give us your money. And there's this kind of like mechanical, hypnotic trance that we're in. And then once I got the bottles up and working, I thought there's this really uncomfortable sexual aspect to this work that I'm not sure that I want out there. But then I thought, well, that's cool because sexual desire is like at the heart, it's the heart of desire, right? And the industry's playing on our desires. You gotta have, you want, you know. And I just liked making that comparison. And I guess that's, and the bottles, I will say, so thinking about hypnosis, while I'm peeling off all the labels, the Coke labels and the juice, the texts and the pictures of the juice, get down to the little plastic bottles, they're all penises. They're variations on penises, every one of them. And I thought, this is really wild. It makes me think about, subliminal advertising, what they're really doing to us. We're walking around with their little bottles and how do you choose that particular bottle in the convenience store? It's a thought. Okay. Next. Okay, so this piece I chose because it was difficult to see. I just finished this last week. And so you see the first piece I made in plastic bottles and the most recent piece. And this piece is a wall work, and it's also a square. And it's also got stretched fabric, like the pumped work. This is called Nova. And they're plastic bottles that are exploding out of a speaker-like background. And there are LED lights in there, and I've jammed saran wrap around the bottles to give kind of a nebulosity to this exploding star bottle image. And what do I want to say about it? In the course of working with plastics, I've done tons of research about plastics in the environment, what it's doing in landfills, what it's doing in the water. And you probably all have some sense of the gyres of trash that are swirling around and landfills overflowing. Here's a good fact. Did you know that in landfills now, landfills are primarily, the stuff coming into them is plastic packaging. Like when you pull off, you buy something in the store and you pull off the little vacuum pack top, you just throw it away. Total waste. That's what the bulk of landfills is now, plastic packaging. The other interesting plastic thought I had driving here to tell you was that, all right, plastic's not biodegradable, right? It degrades into smaller bits of plastic. And there are debates in certain areas anyway about in the oceans whether the plastic bits are now exceeding the amount of plankton in the oceans. Probably not yet, but we're headed there because 100 million tons are manufactured annually, and we're making more, even though we know it's a problem and the stuff's washing up on islands in the middle of the Pacific, and we keep making more rather than less. So this is an image about bottles busting out, unable to be contained anymore. You want to, oh wait, let me think, what's the next one? Is it a side view? All right, you can put it on that. The side view might be a little easier to see. The speaker behind the bottles has, inside the frame, I've put a little MP3 player and a loop of music by the musicians in Papua New Guinea called the Latmo Ensemble. And they play the New Guinea flute, which is a wooden bamboo flute, and log drums. And they make this amazing vibrational sound. And I chose it to be the soundtrack behind the work because if you blow into the bottles on my piece, it'll make the same kind of vibrational sound. It's quite interesting. And I like the idea of combining a society so close to nature like they are. And you can see the Latmol Ensemble on YouTube, and they're in their banana leaf outfits, and they're playing away. And it's really primitive and really beautiful. And I just like the comparison of us today and thinking about, a society so close to nature. And I framed the whole thing inside of an exploding star image because I like the idea of astronomical time and geological time, where what we're doing to this planet, however terrible it is, time will heal all wounds. Eventually, like 1,000 years from now or more, the plastic will biodegrade and return back to nature. We might not be around to see it, so it's good to have conversations like this where we can actually make decisions, about desire, right? Like, how much do we let desire rule our lives? Desire doesn't bring happiness. Desire brings pain and suffering. If you've ever had a past relationship, you know that. Or, it's what Buddhists tell us, right? Desire leads to suffering, not happiness. So these are like big conversations. And hopefully, we get to a place where, as, a species, we decide that borders between nations are meaningless, or that a global currency makes sense, right? Where everybody's on equal footing and exploitation can't happen. But we're doing what we're doing. And I like the image of the exploding star because we're evolving, and no matter what. So it's like a positive thing to think about in the midst of the horror of it. So you can play my hokey video if you want, my unedited, unedited clip. And hear the New Guinea flute. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simone,
Thank you.
Eviva, Jeff, Dr. Schmidt. It was really interesting. I really loved this.